All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to week number 9. That is right, week number 9 of your 9489 class, which is your cultural heritage class. As always, I'm your professor, Dr. JSK Austin, and what we are going to do in today's check-in video is first we are going to deliver a quick state of the course update. After we get done with our state of the course updates, we are going to go into a little bit of theory, a little bit of information about sports as cultural heritage. As you all know, it is March. March Madness March Madness has already begun. March Madness actually begins with the conference tournaments, just so you know. But now we are heading into the big dance. And by the way, I am a University of South Carolina alumnus, so you will see the mighty Gamecocks led by the great Dawn Staley, march their way all the way to the championship. At least that's what I hope. But if not, oh well, we won the championship last year with the undefeated season, so beat that anyway. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get into this state of the course update pause. First things first, we do have our cemetery. Our cemetery is cultural heritage more than just a resting place sort of unit this week. And that is I think it's an interesting unit in part because of how successful it has been in the past. So for the most part, I'll say this. When I was designing the course for the first time back in 2020, I was a little worried about this module. I was wondering if people would think it was morbid. I was wondering if it would pique people's interest. I was just wondering if this was something that I was going to keep in the class or if it was something that I was going to have to take out. And it turned out that this turned out to be some of the students' favorite modules. There are a lot of students, especially if they have archaeological backgrounds, which makes sense, or anthropology backgrounds, which again makes sense. They are very interested in resting places and cemeteries and the cultural heritage implications of those things and why so many cultures around the world honor their dead and bury their dead and do more than just throw them in a pit or something like that. All of that comes from cultural heritage. And again, I think it's something that is in our DNA. We have ancient cultures out there who never came in contact with one another and didn't have documentation or access to documentation of like supposed best practices of what to do with the dead and those sorts of things. And yet you find so many cultures bury their dead, honor their dead, have excuse me, what is that word? Got a little tongue-tied there, yeah, memorials for their dead and that sort of thing. So honoring the deceased it's human. It's across many cultures. It's therefore, again, something that I feel is in our DNA. And if it's something that is in our DNA, then it is something relevant to cultural heritage. It's, again, one of those things that even if our differences, yes, there are differences in how cultures honor the dead. Not all cultures do bury their dead, but many cultures do, and then even those that don't, they still do things to honor the dead. They may bury things that with the dead that those people liked. A lot of times, for instance, the ancient Egyptians buried toys with the dead, and they would be toys that deceased person liked. And you would find that in other cultures, you also see people being buried with things that they liked or enjoyed or that meant something to them. So when these things are all happening, and they're all happening with cultures that really don't have any historic tie or connection to one another, that is when I come in and I say, hey, this is something we don't understand. DNA completely. We don't understand inheritance completely. Yes, the scientific advancements that we've had in recent years have brought us a long way. But every now and then you still see these scientific discoveries. For instance, there had been a scientific discovery not too long ago about how trauma is inherited. And this was applied to, okay, this might be why you see certain behaviors in certain populations is because of trauma that was inherited. I think this was actually focused on an indigenous American population that had gone through a lot of trauma, and that trauma that occurred to them during European colonization, there was inherited trauma, and so they were linking some of the issues plaguing that indigenous community now with some of the trauma that they had experienced in the past. So we inherit, of course, physical traits, and everybody knows that, and everybody knows that we inherit some of our behaviors too. For instance, there are chemical imbalances. If anxiety runs in your family, then we know that it might be something that you inherit as well. But I would say that these cultural nuances are also probably something that is inherited. But I don't think that the people who, the biologists who actually look at these sorts of things, I don't think that they really are ready to dive into the cultural aspects of inheritance quite yet, because they're frankly more, I think, more important things to them that they're trying to analyze. Because a lot of times when people are trying to look at, when scientists are trying to look at what is inherited from one generation to the next, they are trying to actually solve problems. And so they might be looking, for instance, at health issues that are inherited and how these health issues can be sort of predicted within the human genome and those sorts of things. So, of course, heritage is going to take a back seat there, and I don't have a biology background, so I can't begin that research myself. But when that research does start, I do think that we are going to see that, yes, these heritage implications, they are also, these heritage practices that we have, they stem from something that we inherit in our DNA. I am quite sure that that's the case. That is my hypothesis, and hopefully some biologist one day will work with me to really run through it and see if what I am saying is correct. So that's what it is. But yes, so the cemetery unit turned out to be a hit with a lot of students in the past, so I have not gotten rid of this one. And people have not found it, at least they have not told me that they found it morbid or anything like that. They've actually been very concerned with how cemeteries and preservation of bodies and that sort of thing ties into other forms of preservation. And you know, we've been talking about preservation throughout this class because cultural heritage is also largely about preservation. So I hope you enjoy this week's unit, and that's what we will be reading about, and I look forward to looking at your discussions there. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is that I do think that Stuart Hines' presentation from last week went very well. Not just from Stuart's standpoint, but also you all were engaged. You all do all the things that I ask you all to do in these presentations. And so I was very pleased with the behavior that I saw last week with you all engaging with Stuart. And I was glad that Stuart did update the presentation. He shared a little bit more with us about how the current administration is affecting archives, especially archives related to DEI, and certainly sexual orientation and gender expression are also things that are related to DEI. It's not just all about race, and that's part of the problem that we're running into, is a lot of people think that it's all about race. It is not. And you are seeing now that people like Stuart, people who are who really don't concern themselves with researching or preservation around race much at all, they are still being targeted because of what they are working with. And in Stuart's case, that is working with what I call QT materials, queer trans materials, and that sort of thing. So yeah, Stuart did a wonderful job, and I hope that you all pulled away. I hope that one takeaway that you all got out of that presentation is that, yes, when you are doing this type of work, there are going to be eyes on you, and you are accountable to a lot of these people who have their eyes on you. That, again, is why we should not call librarianship activism, because an activist is not accountable to the power structure. Somebody who's a real activist is not going to be somebody who's going to be quaking in their boots about a state legislator actually reviewing their emails or something like that and trying to get them fired based on what's in their state-owned emails and your state-owned time. So that makes you an advocate. If you are, again, I see a lot of librarians every day that just they're wannabe activists, and they go around calling themselves activists when they are accountable to the power structure, and that makes no sense at all. Again, in my community, in the Black community, anyone who worked for the government who wound up calling themselves an activist would just be laughed out of the room, because when Black people think activists, we think Huey Newton, we think Harriet Tubman, we think Fred Hampton. We do not think of somebody who's working at a comfortable desk at a government-funded job. That is not activism. So if you want to learn more about that, then look up activism versus advocacy, and I've actually done a book chapter on that concept myself. But you'll see a lot out there, and what librarians are advocates, and a lot of these problems that we're running into in libraries right now with accountability and with people being watched is because librarians wanted to overstep. They decided that they didn't want to be advocates, they wanted to be activists, but you can't be an activist while you are being controlled by the purse strings of the government. So these are things that we have to be mindful of, okay? And so I hope that one thing that you were able to kind of pull away from Stuart's presentation last week was that what's going on there is, again, Stuart is an advocate. He is somebody who goes out in the community. He gets these materials, he processes these materials, he preserves these materials, all the things, but he does that under the guise of being an advocate. And so he does realize that his employment and his well-being even is due to the will of the government structure, is due to the will of the taxpayers. He is at UMKC, which is a taxpayer-supported institution, okay? So he knows the things that he should do and he knows the things that he should not do. And when you run into these wannabe activist librarians, they totally do not understand what they should not be doing, and they make things worse for the rest of us. Don't be one of those people, all right? The third thing that I want to talk about when it comes to this State of the Course update is going to be right here. I do want you all to be aware that on on March the 31st, which is the Monday after we come back from spring break, on that Monday, we will have our mini interview with the cultural heritage worker due. And it is not due on the Sunday because the Sunday is technically still spring break. But when you all come back from spring break, this will be due. If you want to go ahead and just get it out of the way now so you don't have to worry about it during spring break, that is totally fine. This is not an assignment this should be 5 easy points, folks. This should not be an assignment that is going to take up a lot of your time. It is not an assignment that should stress you or anything like that. Basically, you've got the questions right there. You can add more questions if you want, but you got to at least ask those 5 questions. You can send it to a cultural heritage worker through email. They can email you back, and then you can post that question and answer. And it is that simple. This is not something that has to be fancy if you don't want it to be. Now, if you want to be creative, if you want to be a little fancy with it, by all means, go ahead. I will allow that, but certainly do not feel any pressure to be fancy or to do anything more than just a basic Q&A. And again, well, first of all, one thing that I will notice, this is kind of a slight FERPA violation, but it's one that I would get away with. I will say that your classmates who have already submitted, they've done what the spirit of the assignment asked them to do, and so they will get good grades on that. And so you all, if you follow what your classmates have already done as an example, you'll get the perfect 5 out of 5 as well. And again, the reason why this is a discussion board sort of assignment is because this is vocational guidance for everybody in the class. So once you actually complete your mini interview with a cultural heritage worker, you post it, and then you can read the submissions that your classmates did. And that can give you some ideas of things, different opportunities that you can have working in the cultural heritage realm, and some of the things that you would need to do in order to get there. And so I do also list out, I should have written that it is not limited to these things. So workers from any of the following are acceptable, but it's not limited just to this. And if you have further questions or you're wondering if somebody is acceptable, then by all means, get in contact with me, tell me what they do, and I will let you know whether or not that will qualify as a cultural heritage worker. But definitely libraries, museums, galleries, archives, plantation sites, non-chain restaurants, local non-chain businesses, zoos, ballparks, concert venues, and people who plan festivals, people who do storytelling, or people who plan or do cultural events. All of those things count, but there are a number of other things that may count as well. So really all you have to do is reach out to me and I will give you the appropriate guidance there. Outside of that, everything seems to be going fine. We will be heading into April full charge, and you all will, by the way, there won't be a check-in video next week because, again, it will be spring break, so I will not be doing a check-in video for this class or for the reference class. So if you have me in the business class, I have made a note that they constructed the schedule, the calendar this time around, so that we actually do have to do the the second week of the 8-week classes is actually on spring break, and I have to actually go through that. So we will have the business class that will advance, and I will have a check-in video next week in that class because that class is not honoring spring break. If you're mad about that, please do not take your anger out on me. I did not design the Mizzou calendar, so you have to take it up with somebody who is above me, please and thank you. All right, that's it for the state of the course update, and we will go into talking a little bit of sport as cultural heritage. Thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this this concept of sports as cultural heritage. Now, when we think about cultural heritage, one of the things that we think about, again, is placemaking and community building and that sort of thing, and looking at how different areas on the planet end up producing different cultures, and different cultures are indigenous to different places on the planet and that sort of thing. But we also talk about how cultural heritage is sort of a stream that kind of binds us all together, right? Or it binds certain groups of people together under this umbrella of culture. And what you're going to find when you talk about sport is a lot of times, especially when we talk about spectator sports and sports where people are actually going and watching other people compete, other people perform, that sort of thing, what you have is that you have a phenomenon, and this is no secret to anybody, you all know this. You have this phenomenon where everybody from one place, a lot of times, I shouldn't say everybody, I use the term everybody too much, but a lot of people who are from a particular place will gather around to support whoever is representing that place in competition, right? So let's say you are, again, we're talking about March Madness. I am an alumnus of the University of South Carolina, at least at the PhD level. So I consider myself a Gamecock fan, right? And the South Carolina Gamecocks women's basketball team is the #2 overall seed. They're a #1 seed, but they're the #2 overall seed in the women's tournament. And so there are a lot of people. I'm not in South Carolina anymore, but I know exactly what's going on in South Carolina because I spent 7 years there. And there are people right now that are just giddy in South Carolina because Dawn Staley has gotten that team another #1 seed. And we are hoping for another championship. We got a championship last year. Yes, more people were concerned with Caitlin Clark than they were the undefeated Gamecocks basketball team. But at the end of the day, what ended up happening is the Gamecocks team went undefeated, and it was our team that brought home that trophy, not Iowa. Okay. And that was something that was a source of pride for a lot of people in South Carolina. A lot of people in South Carolina were able to say, hey, that is part of our community. That Gamecocks team is representing us, right? And it creates what I would say are healthy opportunities for different cultures and different places to kind of compete with one another in ways that don't involve war, that don't involve hopefully don't involve division and that sort of thing, but where you can compete from a place of respect. And what you're going to see as you watch because I know I'm not going to be the only one watching, as we start watching the big dance this weekend, or really on Thursday, and even play-in games before that, when we're watching those games, what we're going to be noticing is that there's not going to be, yes, these people are competing with one another. They are leaving it out on the court. But once they finish that competition, they are not, it is not hard feelings as they are walking back to the locker rooms. They are shaking hands, they are hugging, they are talking to one another, and they are showing a mutual respect. And that is what I wish were always the case when it came to cultural conflicts, that we could always just look at, okay, yes, you represent this element of a culture, I represent that element of a culture, or you represent this culture here in the East, I represent this culture here in the West. But we can come together, we can kind of compete, and then at the end of our competition, we can say, hey, you represented your people well, and I represented my people well, and we have a lot of respect for that. And so we are going to shake hands, hug, talk, and just realize that we were competitors out here, that we competed to show who's the best. And even when we showed on the court who was the best today, we are always aware that on any given day, any given thing can happen. And so we have to respect the fact that everybody put in a lot of work to get where they were in this competition. And the fruits of that are that, you know, again, a mutual respect to the fact that this took hard work, a mutual respect to the fact that you are not just representing yourself out there on the court. You are representing an entire school or an entire community, sometimes even an entire state. And there is a lot of gravity that comes with that. And I know I've been focused kind of on team sports here. I mentioned basketball as an example because of the season that we're in, but I am going to say also, you know, I'm somebody who practices martial arts, and I train with some people who compete, even though I'm not good enough to compete. And one thing that I would say to that is, even with individual sports, as you know, if you've been to a boxing match, if there is a boxer representing the hometown, like if you have a boxing match in Kansas City, and there's somebody from Kansas City, fighting somebody from Wichita or from Topeka, which I've seen plenty of times, everybody in the dome, if it's a fight taking place in Kansas City, is rooting for that Kansas City person to beat that person from Wichita or Topeka or wherever. So it's largely about, again, it's largely about representation. It's largely about, I'm here to represent this community. They're cheering me on because they realize that I'm representing them, and I am going to put on my best for that community, to give some pride to that community, to give some identity to that community, and so forth and so on. And you can see this even with the Kansas City Chiefs. You can kind of see this taking place with, I guess I'll use Travis Kelce as an example, and I'll use Pat Mahomes as an example. So these guys are kind of representing Kansas City to the point where Patrick Mahomes is not just representing Kansas City on the field. You see him in these commercials as well. Like you see him in the State Farm commercials. You'll see Andy Reid, the coach, in these State Farm commercials. And what they're doing, it is a representation. It is a source of pride. When you get to, and those are not local, by the way. Like when I go home, I still see State Farm commercials with Kansas City Chiefs players on them, right? And so that should be a sense of pride, because the reverse isn't happening. I'm from North Carolina. You do not see Carolina Panthers players on commercials that are going on here in Kansas City, because the Carolina Panthers are not relevant, whereas the Kansas City Chiefs are. And so that should be a source of pride. That's a source of pride when people from Kansas City are able to say, our quarterback is seen as the best quarterback in the league right now. Even if he lost the Super Bowl, he is still seen as the best quarterback in the league right now. He's seen as better than Jalen Hurts, who won the Super Bowl, because, hey, the Eagles won the Super Bowl in large part on their defense. Not their offense did their thing too, but they won that Super Bowl largely on their defense. And it's a sense of pride where you can go anywhere in the country and people are talking about seeing Patrick Mahomes on TV. Are people seeing Bryce Young on TV out here in Kansas City? If you live in Missouri, do you even know who Bryce Young is? You might not, unless you're a sports fan, okay? So these are the types of things that we have to think about. All right, let's take a look and dive into this article here. All right, so I'm going to link this article in the announcement that this check-in video is going to come through, and this is a free article. You can download this paper from anywhere. I did not have to go beyond a paywall or anything. This is not a paywall protected thing. It's been downloaded 161 times, so it's been looked at a lot. Sport as cultural heritage, forthcoming in the Handbook of International Sports Law from 2022. So this is definitely something that is already in print now, but this abstract talks about, this is by Lorenzo Cassini, by the way. This chapter is divided into 3 parts. First, it focuses on sport as both intangible and tangible heritage. Second, it considers the relationship between sports and culture with its similarities in terms of policies and institutions. And then third, it draws some remarks in regard to the major challenges such a relationship between such a relationship between sports and culture raises. Sorry about that. Again, you all know I get tongue-tied a lot. But yes, so that's our abstract there, and I'm actually skipping all the way down right from the beginning. I am skipping down to, I wouldn't call this necessarily a research question, because I don't know if I am really going to call this a research piece as opposed to more of a thought piece. But anyway, what you have here is the money question, sport as cultural heritage. Can sport be seen as cultural heritage? Responses to this question may vary according to whatever notion of cultural heritage we adopt. There are several definitions of cultural heritage provided at the international level by different conventions. And in addition, each legal order offers its own notion. So we will consider three examples. The first one relates to the idea of sport as cultural heritage according to the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. The second example refers to sports-related objects such as venues and equipment, which can be declared or treated as cultural property, and these things would be tangible cultural heritage. And then, of course, we do have institutions, which this is kind of a cheap way to go about this, in my opinion. There are museums related to sports. Again, I'm based here in Kansas City, and so we actually have a museum related to sports here in Kansas City. The Negro League Baseball Museum here in Kansas City, that's certainly related to sports. But anytime you put anything in a museum, the museum itself does become an example of cultural heritage by itself, because that's what museums are anyway. So I'm not going to deal too much with that third example of sports museums as cultural heritage, because at this point, if you haven't figured out that museums are in the business of preserving and making accessible cultural heritage, I don't know what to do for you. That was a week one lesson. All right, pause. All right, let's scroll a little bit and kind of read this excerpt here. The 2003 UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage defines intangible cultural heritage as such: the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. The intangible cultural heritage transmitted from generation to generation is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. Now, and this paper makes its own argument, and I agree with the paper's argument, and I'm about to go into it in a second. But even looking at this, it to me is obvious on its face of how sport ends up being considered credible, intangible cultural heritage. Because again, one of the words that I look at, one of the words that I'm kind of teasing out of this definition is that term, two terms actually, identity and continuity. All right. So when you look at identity, again, I was just talking about that. We have identities. We have identities that we associate with our sports. We have Tar Heel Nation. We have Panther Nation. We have Chiefs Kingdom. We have all the various things, right? And these things are, again, form an identity. They form an identity, and they contribute to an identity of a local place. So, and especially when you're dealing with places that might be a bit on the smaller side, but then have a pro sports team, for instance, you can get a lot of identity implications from that. So let's say you have, actually the perfect example is going to be the Green Bay Packers. Green Bay is not a large place, right? I think it actually is the least populated of the metropolitan areas that actually have an NFL team currently. But when you go to Green Bay, there's a large identity that is just associated with the Packers, to the point where you can't separate the Packers from Green Bay. It really is that strong. There are places that you can kind of separate from their team. And again, I'll use Carolina as one of those places. You can have Charlotte without having the Panthers. Certainly you can have Charlotte without having the Hornets, because the Hornets moved to New Orleans for a little while, right? So, but you can't have Green Bay without the Packers. You just can't do it. These things are just tied to one another. The identity is that strong. And you will see this more in the college ranks than you will in the professionals, but the professional ranks. But yeah, you will find places that are considered quote unquote college towns. And I would even argue that Columbia, Missouri is one of them. I don't think you really have the identity of Columbia, Missouri. I don't think that you can separate that from Mizzou. I don't think you can separate that from the Tigers. That's what Columbia is. Columbia is the Mizzou Tigers, and that is the identity, that is the culture. And when you go to Columbia, you will see those tiger emblems all across the place. You will see it on everything. So these identities do not separate from, in this case, when you have those identities that are that strong, they do not separate from the local community. And I do think you also see this outside of the United States a lot as well. So my brother, for instance, my brother is from the Dominican Republic. And there is a strong baseball tradition in the Dominican Republic. And when you look at these different locales in the Dominican Republic, it is so baseball oriented. And you will have so many kids that just tie the identity of their towns to whatever organized baseball is going on in these areas that they live. Okay. So these things don't separate. And that's one of the beauties that I see of it. But that's also one of the things that sort of boisters the case of relating sport to cultural heritage. And then also continuity. Continuity is a big thing because it's what keeps going. It keeps going and going and going. We had a Super Bowl in February. We're going to have another Super Bowl next February, and there'll be a winner of that Super Bowl, and there's continuity. But season after season after season, these NFL teams take the field. They will have different players every single year. Every single year, there's going to be a player on a team that was not on that team last year. But at the end of the day, you do have a continuity there where that team is still playing. That franchise still endures. That franchise endures even when players leave or when players retire, when players get traded. Unfortunately, sometimes also when players die or get arrested and those sorts of things. The franchise lives on. It's continuity and it is inherited. And another thing that you will see when we talk about, again, heritage, inheritance, what we are talking about is things being passed down from generation to generation. Now, let's keep it real. A lot of these people who are Mizzou fans, a lot of times they come from Mizzou families, right? So, and I see a lot of this. I see a lot of students who go to Mizzou, and it's part of a tradition. They go to Mizzou, but also at least one of their parents went to Mizzou, and the parent of one of those parents went to Mizzou, and so forth and so on. And so you have continuity. It passes down from generation to generation, and it does not stop. Now, I will say again, and I've made this point before, I do think that I have a bit of an advantage of perspective here in that I'm from the East Coast originally. The East Coast was settled earlier than Mizzou. So, like, if I were comparing Mizzou to UNC Chapel Hill, for instance, I do see the tradition being a little stronger in Chapel Hill, but also that makes sense because the University of Chapel Hill was founded decades before the University of Missouri was, right? So that just makes sense. And the longer you have these traditions going, the stronger they become. And so that continuity becomes a huge factor there. And then as you see, these continue on even into martial arts right here. So you see Silat is a combative sport of self-defense and survival in Malaysia. And then you'll have different other things. You'll have Taekwondo in Korea. You'll have Karaci in Kazakhstan, Capoeira in Brazil, so forth and so on. And even when it comes to even in particular arts, so you've got something like boxing. But, I know the differences between Dutch style boxing and Russian style boxing and Cuban style boxing and Mexican style boxing. And I'm not just pulling those things out of my behind. Those are distinctions that actually exist. And those distinctions come from, okay, boxing does have international rules, and that's how you are able to get boxers fighting, not on a moment's notice, but on a few weeks' notice. You can have a boxer from Russia fighting a boxer from Cuba, and they don't have to adjust to different rule nuances, right? Whereas, like, even in America, in the United States, if you look at college football and NFL football, there are different rules. There are even different rules in professional football between the UFL and the NFL, right? But when it comes to something like boxing, all over the world, you have a base set of rules. And so people can kind of develop their own styles, and cultures can kind of develop their own styles within these sorts of rules. And you will see, if you watch boxing a lot, what you'll see are commentators very often saying things like, yeah, this is the typical Mexican style of boxing and that sort of thing. And they're, that's not something that anybody's offended by. It's not a stereotype. It actually is the case that there is a boxing culture in Mexico that kind of evolves around certain styles and has evolved around certain styles and certain practices within boxing. Russian style is more so what I do in my sparring, and Russian style basically is a whole lot of pulling, a whole lot of trying to avoid and that sort of thing, which frankly, that's what I do because I tend to be slower than the guys that I spar against. But yes, so there's no, again, I say that to say that, even when you have a sport, and I think that the best examples of this are martial arts, and then also, well, not martial arts, but specifically boxing, and then also soccer. These things to where throughout the globe, you play by the same set of rules, but you have different styles of boxing and different styles even of soccer, depending on where you go around the globe, right? And again, that's a big deal. It shows that we can have respect. We can all play by the same set of rules, but we can develop traditions within those rules that are specific to a particular culture, and then we can compete and we can see how these cultural ways of doing things kind of compete with other ways of doing things in other cultures. But at the end of the day, we still have an opportunity to show each other respect. And this is why I love this type of competition between cultures, as opposed to, say, when you have wars between cultures and people are getting hurt and people are being killed and people's homes are being destroyed, and you don't have that mutual respect there. Nah, to be honest with you, I just wish that all of these conflicts could be handled not through guns and not through the military, but that they could be handled through some sort of competition to where everybody's playing by the same rules, and after it's all over, there's going to be respect. But Dr. Jace is a dreamer. So I did want to elaborate on and kind of flesh out that piece related to the intangible aspects of cultural heritage. But when it comes to the tangible aspects of cultural heritage, I do think that these are going to be more self-explanatory, and I'm not going to really need to elaborate on those too much or soapbox on it too much. Sports-related objects as cultural property, that's pretty obvious. Some of the things as you scroll down in here, some of the things that they talk about, for instance, are Michael Jordan's shoes and things like that. But I would take it even back to things that you will see on displays in museums, including team museums and that sort of thing. You'll see like if you have a Hall of Famer, for instance, Pro Football Hall of Famer, who's an example I can look at? I'll just look at Peyton Manning is in the Hall of Fame at this point. I guarantee you somewhere out there, it might be with the Indianapolis Colts, or it might be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame Museum or wherever, but somewhere out there, there is a preservation effort going on where the ball that Peyton Manning used to throw his first NFL touchdown, that is preserved somewhere. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. It might have been something that Peyton Manning had in his possession at first, but it's probably something that at this point, because he had a multi-year career and everything like that, and his rookie year was a long, long, long time ago. Some of you weren't even born then. But even if he had ownership of that at first, I guarantee you that now it is either with the team or it is with some sort of NFL preservation entity, okay? And that is because, again, these things are important. They're a source of pride. There is I know that the team store for the Carolina Panthers, they've got some information on the first ever Carolina Panthers victory, which was against the New York Jets in 1995. And that victory was cemented by an interception, pick six, by the late, great Sam Mills, okay? And so, again, these things, if you ask a diehard Panthers fan who scored the last touchdown, the game-sealing touchdown in the first ever victory that the Carolina Panthers had, diehard Carolina Panthers fans will tell you without hesitation, a pick six from linebacker Sam Mills. against the New York Jets in 1995. Okay, and so these are the things that that's an example of a heritage object. It's something that's heritage property, but it's also something that spawns pride and spawns identity for people. Okay. Let me wrap this up because it is going a little long, and I'm just going to link this article, but there are a few other points that I want to make, so we'll make this about 10 more minutes. Okay, so first of all, as we're scrolling down, I did want to note that there is a growth, and there's growth within sports museums. A lot of people, I think museums are awesome. I can go to a museum at any time, but hey, that's my job. So of course I'm going to think they're awesome if I'm going to be teaching in this area. But yes, when it comes to libraries, archives, museums, and galleries, GLAM, there is a growth in sports museums, and you will see that sports museums do a lot. They bring a lot in relation to heritage tourism, right? And by the way, these tournaments are also a form of heritage tourism. My undergrad institution, UNC Wilmington, they'll be playing later this week in the big dance against Texas Tech. They're going to get blown out, but they'll be playing against Texas Tech in Wichita. And if I didn't have to spend money on car repairs this week, I was probably going to go see them because Wichita is only 3 hours away. But oh well, my car needed to be addressed, and there went that dream. But I will say that this is a huge part of heritage tourism as well, folks. So one thing that I would say is, because I know some of you are possibly considering how you can commodify heritage tourism. Well, that's one of the ways, is to produce these sports museums. Everybody knows where the Pro Football Hall of Fame Museum is. It's in Canton, Ohio. But what else do we know about Canton? I mean, if you're from Ohio, you probably know a lot about Canton. But I'm not from Ohio, and I've only been there when we had conferences there, and I don't know the first thing about Canton, Ohio. But I do know that the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame Museum is right there. And that is something that I guarantee you, I don't have the numbers, but again, I will guarantee you that when it comes to the Department of Tourism that serves Canton, Ohio, I guarantee you that they lean a lot, and I do mean a lot, on the tourism dollars that are generated through the Hall of Fame game and Hall of Fame, the Hall of Fame, Pro Football Hall of Fame Museum. They're generating revenues off of that, and that is very important. But you can have these museums at different places, as long as you don't have another place that is covering the same thing. You can just be creative, and you could possibly start a museum in a place that generates these tourism dollars. Again, I'm more so familiar with North Carolina. We have the NASCAR Museum in Charlotte. That is a heritage tourism revenue generator for the city of Charlotte, okay, and for the county of Mecklenburg. And these things, again, they're growing because Americans love sports. But you just, again, I would say, find the sport that isn't being adequately covered or covered at all, or find a team that isn't being adequately covered or covered at all. And you're going to have to work with, you'd have to work with that franchise and that sort of thing. You can't just make like I couldn't just make a University of Missouri Sports Museum, Mizzou Tiger Sports Museum, without involving the university, of course. But if I had that notion, if I wanted to say, hey, maybe not in Columbia, maybe in Jefferson City, I could have a Mizzou, a sports museum for Mizzou. You've already got stuff in Columbia in the library there, so you don't really need to make that in Columbia unless you just think that that's something that, again, is going to drive tourism up there. But I don't know what people go to Jefferson City for as far as tourism. But you could have your flagship institution's museum there in Jefferson City, since Jefferson City is the capital, and you could create revenues that way. But yeah, we should always be looking for opportunities to have museums, or if not full-blown museums, special collections within our libraries that give us the opportunity to commemorate and to preserve these things and put them on display so that people can come and see them. And you're going to have fans, and those fans are going to want to see those things, and they will pay to see those things, even if they're not paying for entry. If you're in a library, a lot of museums do charge entry fees, but even if you're in a library, you're probably not going to charge entry fees, but you still have the heritage tourism aspect, because you're not just paying to see. When people do tourism, of course, if they're not just paying to see the thing, but they're also paying to travel. They're purchasing gas. They're purchasing merchandise. They're purchasing food. They are staying in hotels and those sorts of things. And so all of those are revenue generators. You have to look at the economic impact of these things. And by the way, a quick note on economic impact. You will have, because one thing that I remember when, because I was living in Columbia, South Carolina, when Steve Spurrier was the head coach of the South Carolina Gamecocks football team. And people would be, you would have short-sighted people who would say, hey, yes, Steve Spurrier is a legendary coach, but still, why are we paying Steve Spurrier $3 million a year to coach this team when, when we have academic departments that are struggling? And what people don't think about is the economic impact, and that's something you have to think about. Yes, we're paying Steve Spurrier $3 million a year to coach this team, but also the economic impact for Columbia, South Carolina of every single home football game is $6 million. Not just $6 million a year, $6 million per home game. So that's what you have to look at. And again, that's what drives those revenue figures up, and that is what creates jobs and sustains communities, okay? Okay, so just scroll down in this article and we'll see it down here a little bit more. I love this piece right here, this little excerpt. As mentioned above, the Olympic Charter insists on the need to blend sport with culture and education. It indicates this mission for both the International Olympic Committee and for the National Olympic Committees. In addition, the Charter states that each organizing committee of the Olympic Games shall organize a program of cultural events which must cover at least the entire period during which the Olympic Village is open. And so again, I see this as an opportunity to create identity, to display identity, and then from there to promote pride in the identity of a locale, or in this case, since we're talking about the Olympics, of a nation, and the various cultures within that nation, right? So, so we tend to get kind of, I would say, even defensive or scared when we talk about nationalism, and for good reason, because when you talk about nationalism as it relates to politics and nationalism as it relates to potential for war and potential for mistreating people who are minorities within a country, then yes, nationalism can be a very dangerous thing. But when we look at nationalism within a lens of healthy competition, that is something that I don't think is harmful. When we talk about healthy competition, the Olympics, I feel, are a prime example of that. The Olympics are an example of having competition without, well, they're a prime example of having healthy competition without having people actually, again, getting into fights, usually getting into wars of words and that sort of thing, and causing division. I do not think that the Olympics are divisive. I think that they are very much one of the unifying things that we have among these different countries. We need more things that unify us, but I think that the Olympics have done a great job over the centuries now of providing a space to where we compete with one another, and yet we do it respectfully, and we do it without this culture of, because we do have this culture, unfortunately, especially within soccer, where people are actually getting, spectators are actually getting violent with one another if they feel that the people that they're getting violent with are disrespecting their nation or the cultures that they represent, right? But I think that we have these opportunities within the Olympics to kind of come together and say, hey, this is a time of peace, and this is a time for us to promote healthy competition, to be proud of the people who are doing a great job representing us, but at the same time, not participating in something that would be seen as oppressive to other people, okay? And finally, to close, what I do want to leave y'all on is this. This does not come from the article. This is just something that's coming from Dr. Jace. You also do have, and you see it especially here in America, but in a lot of countries throughout the world, you do see where people just develop a large sense of pride related to whatever sports and things are either popular or were invented there, and those do get woven into the fabric of the history and identity of a country. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't the. I hate that I'm using this example, but it does kind of illustrate this point. Years and years ago, I was going back and forth with somebody on Facebook. I don't have time for that in these days, so I'm glad I got rid of Facebook. But back when I had it, I remember going back and forth with somebody about who the real Americans were and what the real American culture was. And this person was a white woman, and this white lady said, well, I think that white people are the real Americans. That's how we see ourselves. Baseball, mom, and apple pie. And that was, now taking the mom thing out of the equation, and we'll talk about food later in this course, but baseball, mom, and apple pie. That's what she said. She said, we white Americans see ourselves as the real Americans because this is America. America is baseball, mom, and apple pie. Now, everywhere mom is mom, right? I don't know a single culture where mom is not respected and valued. And if there is any such culture like that, shame on that culture. But when it comes to baseball and apple pie, yes, apple pie does not originate in the United States, I don't think. I'd have to look that up. I'll look that up by the time we get to the food module, so I've got a few weeks. But certainly when you talk about baseball, we're talking about something that has strong roots within the United States. I would say that the most readily identified sport with the United States in particular isn't football or basketball. I would actually say it's baseball, because you have baseball everywhere. You don't just have pro baseball within the major cities. Yes, you have Major League Baseball within the major cities, but minor league baseball is all over the place. And minor league baseball is still professional baseball, and it's still something that has woven itself into the fabric, the identity of the United States, to the point where people are, when they say, what do I value about America? A lot of people will say sports, and then when you ask them to name a particular sport, a lot of people are going to say baseball, because again, baseball is what you have everywhere. Even once you get outside of the college levels, you will still have minor league baseball, even in small American towns and that sort of thing. And it promotes, again, healthy competition, but healthy and fair competition, to the point where the Toledo Mud Hens are not a major league baseball team, they're minor league. So you'll never see the Toledo Mud Hens playing against the Kansas City Royals, right? But still, there's fair competition. The Toledo Mud Hens do play against teams that are more on their level, and the Kansas City Royals play, again, against teams that are more so on their level. All right? And so that is how you create fair and healthy competition. And you can, again, generate pride within that fair and healthy competition. So those are some things I want you all to think about. We will not have a actual sports module within this class. This is all you're going to get related to sports and cultural heritage. But I think this was the perfect time to do it. So with that being said, the article is linked below. So if you want to check it out and read it for yourself, it is optional reading, but you are certainly welcome to do that. But for now, I am Dr. Jace, and there is a cultural heritage element to a race. There we go. Jace Race. I did my rhyme. I can go to sleep tonight happy. You all be blessed and wonderful, and I will see you in that first week of April, because next week is spring break. Until then, ta-ta.